So Mexico is in a crisis of security and a crisis of violence. Just in January 2019, they released the figures of the numbers of homicides in 2018, 33,000, a bit more. That's the highest number since statistics were gathered in 1997. Statistics don't tell the human tragedy, the human story, but they certainly give us an extent of the depth of the crisis. And there's something like 37,000 people who have disappeared. We didn't want to do just extractive research. In other words, we didn't just want to know more about what was happening. We wanted to know more, but we wanted to do it in a way where we could work with those people who are most suffering violences in their everyday lives. So we chose 4 municipalities of Mexico: Guadalupe, Apatzingán, Acapulco and Tijuana, and we worked with neighbourhoods in each of those places to do what we called co-construction of agendas of human security. In other words, we wanted to work with those communities so that they themselves would analyse their own problems and also search for solutions that were relevant to their locality, to the particularities of what they were experiencing.
A key objective of this project was then, by working with communities, to produce local agendas of human security. These are documents that materialize the process of exploring what are the problems of insecurity and violence in these communities from the perspective of different groups. These agendas also contain ideas, action initiatives and action points that could be suggested to state actors, to civil society organizations, and also to members of the community that are constructed. It's a construction between the residents of these communities and the local researchers. Additionally to these local agendas, we also aim at producing a national agenda, so building from the learning and the process with these communities. The idea was to identify what kind of ideas will come and inform the national debate on security provision in Mexico.
We use 2 concepts that I think we should clarify. One is chronic violence and the other is human security. And by chronic violence, this is because we're trying to look at the multiple violences people experience and not focus just on the violences that most hit the headlines, which of course are terrible, which are the homicides, the drugs-related and criminally related violences. We're also trying to look at the fact that many people live violences in many ways. And they could live violence in the intimate space, violence in the street. And we look at these sort of ways in which violence reproduces through all the socialization spaces. And then human security, we use that concept because on the one hand, it's actually quite difficult for people to talk about security. It can be dangerous. So when you talk about human security, it means people can discuss that idea a little bit more safely. But we also used it because the idea of human security means you're not only concentrating on one form of insecurity. So it's not just the sort of fear of violence. Many people feel insecure in multiple domains. So this could be in health, in education, the environment they live in, lack of jobs. And so by using human security, we opened up relationships with people in the communities who wanted to talk more broadly about those multiple insecurities.
Something that we found by constructing these local agendas in at least 3 of the cities where we work is the issue, for example, of violence inside the home, intrafamily violence, violence motivated by gender issues. So through this process, we are able to kind of bring out those and also make them part of the conversation in the communities. That's something that is very important.
There isn't, Alexandra mentioned earlier, one-dimensional policy towards these issues. There has to be an understanding of how in different localities the situation differs, and therefore people's priorities of what they'd like to see happen differs.
We found that one of the problems that people are facing that is affecting not only their living conditions but also the economic dynamics within the community is extortion. But that's not only the problem. The problem is that people do not feel that they can resort to authorities in search for help when they are victims of this problem. Actually, we found as well that one of the key problems, especially in the case of Tijuana, is that police, members of the local police are actually actively engaging in these criminal activities. So people not only are unprotected, but also victims of the illegal activities that some police officers engage with. So this level of unprotection and feeling abandoned and not having anybody or anyone to resort to in search of justice, or reproduces and amplifies the sense of insecurity and vulnerability that the community experiences.
So one of the things we were interested in is agency, or conscious action for social change. And we discovered, and lots of people with whom we worked pointed out, that one of the problems in people coming to work together to address issues of violence and insecurity is that the parties in Mexico tend to divide the communities. So they tend to offer things to particular groups that are supporters of their particular party, and any leader who emerges gets sucked into that structure, and through that you'll have one leader pitted against another leader, and a less of a culture, if you like, of autonomous social action, which can really enable the community to have a voice towards the authorities, which actually communicates their lived experiences.
This type of problem, we found, has a big impact on the capacity of the community and the residents of these communities to organize and to translate their agency into action. That's something that we highlight as well as part of the contributions of the local security agendas into the national debate, and it's something that shows the importance of analyzing this local context and how other issues that might not be seen as relevant at some point actually play a role into the dynamics of violence. So in this case, the local political culture and these clientelistic dynamics actually play a role in magnifying some of the problems that violence has produced in the communities. One of the most important objectives of the project is how these agendas can serve as tools to rethink new strategies to address the problem of violence and new ways of thinking and imagining security provision in this context.
We recognise this is complex for a policy community that often looks for quick fixes. And this is the danger, I think, that politicians often come in who feel they have to offer a solution tomorrow or in the 6 years of the presidency. And what we're suggesting is that actually, by doing something which really takes on board local experiences and acknowledges the complexity, but works with people who actually also recognise this, but are capable of making proposals, you could find a more sustainable response to the problems facing Mexico today.
This kind of more detailed understanding of the local context has a lot of potential to inform wider dynamics in the country in terms of narrative. We found that it's very common to hear that the problem in Mexico is about drug trafficking or is about the competition between criminal actors for illegal economies. But what we found through this process is that the problem in Mexico is much more complex. It's a complex combination of different forms of violence, not all lethal, some of them being visible and silenced, non-lethal forms of violence that interconnect and reinforce each other in a very complex process. And this reproduction process is taking place in a complex context of corruption, impunity, and obviously the expansion of illegal economies. So what that means is that rather than a dimensional security policy, we need to be thinking about a multidimensional security policy that allows us to rethink the participation of people on the ground and how we can actually involve their voices, their experiences, but also how can we have national conversations about how to rethink how we understand violence.
And we were very clear that security must be understood as a public good. We are doing work with communities on security, but the whole idea was that we would encourage the view that security has to be seen as delivered by a state that doesn't reproduce more violence, but also to enable the society at every level to realise that it doesn't benefit everybody that only the wealthy can buy security, that they can have private security, that actually everybody has a right to feel safe. So therefore that public security has to be equitable, it has to be accessible to every community, and it has to be underpinned by the rule of law, and it has to be dedicated to make sure that any security act must not reproduce violence, but it should also enable participation, it should enable the democracy to deepen.
And that's what we call the humanization of security provision in Mexico.